The house stood tall at the end of a quiet street, its white walls shining under the soft light of the moon. From the outside, it looked perfect. Every window sparkled like glass in a jewelry shop. The garden smelled like fresh roses, and the trees outside danced gently with the night wind. Anyone passing by would think it was a place where nothing bad could ever happen. But inside that house, on that particular night, something very different was unfolding. It was just after 8 in the evening. The house was silent, except for the soft sound of the old clock in the hallway. Each tick-tock seemed louder than usual, almost as if the house itself knew something was about to change. Upstairs, in a warm, cozy room decorated with toys and soft blankets, a little girl sat on the floor with her younger brother. She had long brown hair tied in a small ponytail and wore pink pajamas with little stars on them. Her brother, still small enough to hold his favorite toy wherever he went, leaned against her shoulder. The two children had spent the whole day playing, drawing pictures and building tiny houses with blocks. Their laughter usually filled the house, but tonight the air felt heavy. The girl could sense something strange. She didn't understand it fully. She was too young for that. But children often feel things before they're explained. She kept looking toward the door as if expecting someone to appear. Downstairs, the big chandelier gave off a soft golden light. Everything in the living room was perfectly in place. The leather sofa, the crystal vases, the framed family pictures on the wall. In those pictures, the family looked happy, smiling at the camera, hugging each other, standing together at parties and vacations. But sometimes photographs can hide the truths that words don't say. The children's mother sat on one of the couches, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She stared at the floor without really seeing it. Her eyes were tired, and her heart felt even heavier. She was a woman who once smiled easily, but lately her smiles had become rare, like sunlight behind dark clouds. She wasn't a bad person. She wasn't a cruel person. She was just lost in a storm she didn't know how to stop. For weeks, she'd been feeling a kind of pressure inside her that she couldn't explain. Every little thing felt too loud, too big, too hard. The house that once felt warm now felt like a cage she couldn't escape. And while she loved her children deeply, the noise, the responsibility, and the emptiness she carried inside her heart made her feel trapped. Upstairs, the little girl hugged her brother. She could hear soft footsteps coming from the hallway. It was her mother, slowly making her way up the stairs. Usually, the sound of her footsteps brought comfort. It meant bedtime stories, goodnight kisses, and warm blankets. But tonight the sound felt different. Slower, uneven, a bit like the wind. Just before a big storm, the girl turned to her brother, her little hands gently squeezing his. "Mommy's coming," she whispered softly, more to herself than to him. He looked up at her with big, innocent eyes. He didn't understand why her voice sounded so unsure. He didn't understand why her hands were shaking just a little. The door opened slowly with a small creak. Their mother stepped inside. Her hair was loose and slightly messy, and her eyes looked far away, as if she was seeing something only she could see. The girl wanted to run into her arms like she always did, but something held her back. She stayed where she was, sitting on the floor, holding her brother tight. Their mother's eyes moved around the room from the toys on the floor, to the drawings on the wall, to the two little faces looking up at her. For a brief moment, something soft crossed her face, like a wave of love that was still there, buried under all the noise inside her mind. But then it faded again, leaving only that faraway look. "Bedtime," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. Normally, those words would come with a gentle smile. Tonight, they came without it. The little girl slowly stood up, holding her brother's hand. She didn't want to make any noise. She didn't want to make anything worse, though. She didn't even know what worse meant. She just knew everything felt fragile. Like thin glass, the mother walked toward the bed and started picking up the scattered toys one by one. Her hands moved quickly, almost nervously. A small stuffed bear fell from her grip and landed on the floor with a soft thud. That sound so small, so ordinary, made the little girl flinch. She didn't know why. "Pick up your things," the mother said, her voice a little sharper this time. The girl bent down quickly, helping her brother gather the toys. Her brother still didn't fully understand what was happening. To him it was just another night. But he followed her lead, quiet and obedient. The air inside the room was still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Meanwhile, at the other end of town, their father was driving home earlier than usual. He was a well-known businessman, the kind people read about in magazines. Tall buildings, expensive suits, important meetings, that was his world. But what most people didn't know was that behind all that success, he was a man who loved his children more than anything. He carried their pictures in his wallet, he checked in with them every night, and whenever he spoke about them, his face lit up. He hadn't planned to come home early that night. A meeting had been canceled at the last minute, and instead of going out with his colleagues, something inside him told him to go home. He didn't question it. He just drove. The city lights passed by his car windows as he thought about how he hadn't spent much time with the kids lately. He felt guilty for that. He promised himself he'd fix it. Back in the children's room, their mother sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands pressed against her forehead. She wasn't angry at her children. She wasn't angry at anyone. She was just tired. Tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. She loved them deeply, but the storm inside her made it hard to show it. The little girl watched her carefully. At her young age, she couldn't name the feelings she saw, but she understood enough to know that something was not right. She wanted to say something, maybe "I love you," maybe "Are you okay, Mommy?" But her voice felt stuck. Then it happened. A moment so quick, so small, yet it changed everything. The mother lowered her hands and let out a long, shaky breath. She looked at the children again, and this time the storm in her eyes grew stronger. Her voice rose a little, not in anger, but in frustration that had been building up for weeks. "Why can't everything just be quiet for one night?" she said softly, almost to herself. The little girl stepped closer. She held her brother's hand tighter. Her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't fully understand the words, but she understood the feeling. She felt scared, not because of her mother, but because she didn't know how to help. She didn't know what to do. Downstairs, the father parked his car in the driveway. He stepped out, breathing in the cold night air. Usually the house looked warm and welcoming from here, but tonight something felt different. He couldn't explain why, but a strange feeling crept into his chest. He walked up the steps a little faster than usual, his keys jingling nervously in his hand. The little girl finally found her voice. In a soft, trembling tone, she whispered, "Mommy, please don't be upset." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of her tiny heart, and then like a thunderbolt breaking through the quiet, a single high-pitched cry echoed through the house. "Mommy, don't hurt us." The words spilled out of her before she even realized she'd said them. She didn't mean to shout. She wasn't even sure why those words came. But they came from a place of fear, confusion, and love, all mixed together. Downstairs, the father froze. The keys slipped from his hand and landed on the floor with a small clink. He knew his daughter's voice. He knew her cries. And this one was different. This wasn't a playful scream or a cry over a broken toy. This was something else. His heartbeat quickened. He rushed through the hallway, his shoes echoing against the floor. Each step felt heavier than the last. He didn't think, he just moved. The staircase seemed longer than ever. The chandelier lights blurred as he raced upward, back in the room. The little girl held her brother as if trying to protect him from something she couldn't even see. Her eyes were wide, her heart racing. Her mother's face softened for a split second. She didn't mean to scare them. She loved them. But everything inside her was tangled like 1,000 knots she couldn't untie. The father's footsteps grew louder. He was almost there. The mother closed her eyes as if trying to shut out the noise in her head. For a moment, the room felt frozen in time. The little girl stood there, small but brave, holding her brother tightly. The golden nightlight glowed softly on the wall, casting gentle shadows across their faces. Then the father reached the door. He didn't knock. He didn't wait. He opened it fast, his chest rising and falling. His mind filled with 100 questions he didn't have time to ask, and there they were, his daughter, clutching her little brother, his wife, sitting on the bed with tired eyes, and a silence so deep it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. The little girl looked up at him. Her eyes were wet, but shining with relief. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her face said everything. The father stepped into the room. And in that single moment, the perfect image the world saw of their family cracked quietly. Not with noise. Not with chaos. Just with the truth that things were not as perfect as they seemed, but that mom. The father stood at the door, his chest rising and falling as if he had just run a marathon. His heart was racing, but his mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in a long time. The sight before him was not something he had ever imagined. He had built a life where everything looked perfect. Beautiful house, beautiful family, and the kind of success people admired from far away. But what he saw in that quiet room was real, raw, and honest. And it was that honesty that would change everything. His daughter clung to her little brother, her tiny hands wrapped tightly together. Her eyes met his, wide, shining, and filled with a mixture of fear and hope. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. One look was enough. It was the kind of look that spoke louder than 100 words. It was a plea to make things safe again. The mother sat on the bed, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She wasn't angry. She wasn't cruel. She was lost, like someone trying to find her way out of a maze with no map. For so long she had carried her feelings alone, covering them with smiles for the world to see. But masks, no matter how perfect, always crack when pain becomes too heavy. The father slowly stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The room felt smaller now, but warmer too, as if his presence had brought a quiet strength with it. He walked gently toward his children, careful not to make any sudden moves. The little girl's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen her father look this way before, not like the busy man who always rushed to meetings, but like a father who was here fully. For her, he knelt down on the soft carpet, lowering himself to their level. His suit jacket wrinkled, his tie hung loose, but none of that mattered anymore. What mattered were the two small faces staring back at him. He stretched out his arms without saying a word. The little girl hesitated for only a second, then ran into his embrace. Pulling her brother with her, he wrapped them both in his arms, holding them tight but gentle, as if they were the most precious thing in the world, because to him they were. He felt their tiny hearts beating fast against his chest, their breaths shaky, their fingers gripping his shirt, as if they didn't want to let go. And in that quiet moment, the world outside didn't exist. No business meetings, no deadlines, no public image. Just love. The mother watched them from the bed. Her heart ached, not from anger, but from a deep sadness that had been hidden for too long. She loved her children. She loved her husband too. But somewhere along the way, she had gotten lost inside her own mind. She had tried to be strong, to smile, to act like everything was fine. But pretending to be fine doesn't make the pain go away. The father slowly looked up at her. Their eyes met, and in that gaze there were no loud words, no blame, no arguments. Just quiet understanding. He didn't see her as a villain. He saw the woman he had married, the woman who once laughed with him under starlit skies, used to sing softly to their daughter before bedtime. He saw a woman who was tired, struggling, but still loved deeply. "Everything's going to be okay," he whispered softly, mostly to his children but also to her. His voice was calm and steady, like a warm blanket on a cold night. The little girl looked up at him, her lips trembling. "Promise?" she asked in the smallest voice. He nodded slowly. Promise. The promise wasn't just about words. It was about everything that would come next. It was about being there, truly there. It was about listening. It was about healing what had been ignored for too long. He gently guided the children to sit on the bed, close to their mother. The room still carried a heavy silence, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was softer. This one was the silence just before a storm passes and sunlight starts to break through the clouds. The mother's hands trembled slightly as she reached out. The little boy was the first to lean toward her, his tiny arms wrapping around her waist. His love was pure, untouched by the worries of adults. The little girl followed slowly, her steps unsure but brave. Their mother held them close, closing her eyes as the warmth of their little bodies filled the cold corners of her heart. She whispered their names softly, almost like an apology, but also like a promise of her own. The father stood beside them, his presence strong and quiet. In that moment, they weren't just a family with a problem. They were a family facing the truth together. And that is where real change begins, not in perfection, but in honesty. Later that night, after the children had fallen asleep, the father and mother sat on the edge of their bed. The house was quiet except for the sound of the night breeze brushing against the windows. For years, they had avoided real conversations. They had built their lives on schedules, appearances, and routines. But tonight, none of that mattered anymore. She stared at her hands, feeling ashamed of how lost she had become. "I don't even recognize myself anymore," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He reached out and gently took her hand. "Then let's find you again," he said simply. There was no blame in his voice, no judgment, just love. Just the quiet strength of someone who had finally opened his eyes. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Not from fear this time, but from relief. She had been carrying the weight of silence for too long. And now, finally, someone was holding it with her. They talked for hours. Not about work, or appearances, or what people would think. They talked about feelings. About how she had been feeling empty and overwhelmed. About how he had been too busy to notice. About the children, their laughter, their fears, their dreams. For the first time in a long time, they weren't just two adults living under the same roof. They were a team. The next morning, the sun gently touched the curtains in the children's room. The little girl opened her eyes slowly, the warmth of the sunlight falling on her face. For a second, she didn't remember the night before. But then she turned and saw her father sitting on the edge of her bed, watching her with a gentle smile. He was still in the same house, but something about him felt different, warmer, softer, more present. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said softly. "Good morning." "Daddy," she replied, her voice sleepy but calm. Her little brother was still asleep, holding onto his toy like a tiny explorer holding a treasure. The little girl stretched her arms and climbed into her father's lap, wrapping her arms around him. He hugged her close and kissed the top of her head. "Everything's going to be okay," he whispered again. And this time, she believed him. Downstairs, their mother stood in the kitchen, pouring juice into 2 small cups. Her hands still trembled a little, but there was something new in her heart, a quiet determination. She had decided deep inside that she wouldn't let the storm inside her keep growing. She wanted to heal. Not just for herself, but for the 2 little hearts who looked up to her with trust, and for the man who still stood by her side. When the children came down, she greeted them with a soft smile. It wasn't a forced smile like before. It was small, real, fragile but real. The little girl looked up at her carefully, then slowly walked over. Her mother bent down and opened her arms. And this time, the little girl didn't hesitate. She ran straight into her embrace. The father watched this scene from the dining table. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't a loud feeling. It was quiet, steady, like the first light after a long night. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more quiet talks, more work to do, more healing to embrace. But they were no longer pretending. And that made all the difference. Over the next few weeks, little things began to change. The father started spending more time at home. He made sure to have dinner with the family every night, no matter how busy he was. He learned to put down his phone and listen, really listen. When his wife or children spoke, the mother started taking small steps to care for herself again. She talked to people who could help her, people who understood what she was going through. She learned to let herself rest, to breathe, to be gentle with her heart. She discovered that healing isn't about becoming perfect again. It's about learning to live fully, even when things aren't perfect. The little girl began to laugh again. At first, it was soft and shy, like the sound of a small bell in the distance. But slowly it grew louder, brighter, like sunlight filling a room. She felt safe again. Not because everything was perfect, but because she could feel her parents' love wrapping around her like a warm blanket. Her brother, still young, didn't fully understand everything that had happened. But he could feel the change. He felt it in the way their home sounded different, more laughter, less silence. He felt it in the way their mother hugged them more often, the way their father tucked them in at night. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the little girl climbed onto her father's lap and whispered, "Daddy." "Yes, sweetheart." He answered. "Thank you for coming that night," she said, her eyes big and honest. He hugged her a little tighter. "I'll always come for you," he replied softly, and he meant it with all his heart. The family wasn't perfect. They still had hard days. There were still moments of tiredness, moments when the mother needed quiet, moments when the father had to remind himself to slow down. But they faced those moments together now, not in silence. The house that once felt heavy began to feel alive again. The laughter of the children filled the halls. The mother smiled more often.